to increase the costs and barriers to energy development on federal lands. I'll begin with the most egregious of this bill's deficiencies, which is the outsourcing of federal regulatory power to a non-government entity with a clear ideological agenda. Section 2 of the legislation cites disclosure standards created by the SASB, as discussed, and proposes to mandate that entities seeking or holding leases on federal land file reports which comply with the SASB standards in effect at the date of the filing of that report. Thus, if and when the SASB makes changes to its standards, the disclosure requirements for federal leaseholders and seekers will automatically change by action of law. This means that the SASB would have the regulatory power to set disclosure standards for federal leasing. The SASB is not a government agency. Its board is not appointed by the President or confirmed by the Senate. It is entirely independent of the federal government. Put simply, this is an unconstitutional delegation of federal regulatory power. While the Supreme Court has historically been very lenient about delegations of congressional authority to executive branch agencies, it has been unequivocal that delegation of legislative powers to private entities is unconstitutional. The delegation of the regulatory power to set disclosure standards to the SASB cannot pass constitutional muster. The reasoning for this blanket constitutional bar is made obvious by the situation we see before us. The SASB is an explicitly ideological organization. It seeks to promote adoption of its views of what constitutes sustainability. It was founded and funded by organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation and Bloomberg Philanthropies, and as previously discussed, Michael Bloomberg is a former chairman of the organization, and he remains chairman emeritus today, even as he runs for president, on a platform of halting fossil fuel development on federal lands. The legislation would give this ideological organization the unchecked power to set regulatory standards for federal leasing. The conflict here is obvious. Handing regulatory authority to the SASB as proposed in this bill is analogous to a conservative member of Congress proposing a bill to hand over some aspect of federal regulatory authority to the Heritage Foundation. Both the title of this legislation and the press release and discussion from its sponsors imply that there is a lack of transparency about the current leasing process on federal lands, but this is very misleading. The disclosures contemplated in the SASB guidelines are, in many instances, duplicates of information that leaseholders already report to federal agencies, while other parts of the guidelines are completely irrelevant to the operation of a federal lease. For example, leaseholders already report emissions to the EPA, including for greenhouse gases. However, unlike existing reporting requirements, the SASB doesn't actually include any metrics for how compliance with their reports can be assessed. Likewise, the SASB standards include disclosures about biodiversity impacts, but federal leases are already subject to the NEPA process. For additional SASB sections like business ethics, community relations, and security and human rights, besides those being vague concepts, it's not clear what bearing those subjects have on a company's competency to manage a lease on federal lands. So rather than a genuine bid for transparency, this legislation is more accurately described as an effort to impose higher costs on energy leasing on federal lands. The vagueness of many of the SASB guidelines serves a dual purpose in this raising of costs. On the front end, a company has to come up with new accounting and compliance processes in order to collect and produce the information demanded. And then on the back end, the vagueness opens up new avenues for litigation from anti-development organizations over judgment call calculations or assertions that one of the extraneous disclosure categories hasn't been completed satisfactorily. Use of the SASB guidelines is also a backdoor effort to achieve regulatory goals under the guise of transparency that otherwise could not pass Congress. For example, one of the primary criticisms of the Obama administration's proposed methane regulations was the steep cost of new monitoring equipment needed to comply with the rules. Requiring the SASB disclosures would impose those same monitoring costs, though this time not even with the justification of trying to reduce methane emissions. As drafted, the legislation is poorly constructed. It's expensive, duplicative, and frankly unconstitutional. Mandating the SASB standards looks suspiciously like using federal power to coerce participation in a private NGO's pet project. If Congress wishes to create standards for sustainability for federal leasing or for any other federal contracting, the appropriate process is to provide a mandate to the relevant federal agencies to develop standards through the administrative process. In addition to having the advantage of being constitutional, such a process has long-standing administrative procedure and legal principles that ensure the rights of the companies and individuals impacted by the standards are protected. Thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. And now the committee recognizes Dr. Goldman for your testimony. Welcome to the committee, Dr. Goldman.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal and Ranking Member Gosar, for the opportunity to testify at this important hearing. My name is Dr. Gretchen Goldman, and I serve as the Research Director in the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. For nearly a decade, I've been working on corporate engagement on climate science and policy, community right to know, and public access to scientific information. Communities around the country have long been affected by the activities of the fossil energy industry. These communities endure environmental hazards and health impacts without even knowing what's in the air they breathe or the water they drink. This is the reason regulatory safeguards and disclosure requirements exist, to protect people. Energy companies have an obligation to disclose the social and environmental impacts of their operations. These are common sense expectations. Yet current disclosure by the fossil energy industry is woefully inadequate. Companies continue to operate on public lands close to residential areas and with minimal oversight. This lack of disclosure leaves decision makers, investors, and communities in the dark, costing taxpayers and threatening public health and safety. This is why we need legislation like the Transparency in Energy Production Act of 2020. H.R. 5636 would help ensure access to vital information that can protect the public and promote responsible corporate governance. A record of bad behavior demonstrates that the fossil energy industry needs our oversight, not our trust. Fossil energy companies have consistently failed to report sufficient details on their social and environmental impacts. This is despite requirements by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and despite investor and public pressure. If companies aren't honest about what's happening in their backyards, how can we trust them to be honest about what is happening in ours? Companies' social license to operate is contingent upon their being a transparent and responsible actor. Unfortunately, from refusals to share basic information with decision makers and medical personnel, to preventable explosions that have evacuated entire communities, to illegal dumping and unsafe practices, fossil energy companies have lost the public trust. This isn't just about disclosure. It's about the rights of communities to know about public health threats and to have the information they need to protect themselves. When this information is concealed, people are unable to make informed decisions about their daily lives. Should my child play in our yard? Is our water safe to drink? Is it safe to breathe the air? The answers to these simple questions can mean the difference between an uneventful day and another trip to the emergency room. Increasingly, and disproportionately, it is low-income communities, communities of color, and indigenous communities living, working, and going to school near energy production sites. It is these communities that must ask these simple questions and face companies' insufficient answers. Continued lack of disclosure by the fossil energy industry has meant communities have had to advocate for themselves, negotiating with companies, conducting community science, and fighting in the courts, all to access information that should be public. The disclosures outlined in H.R. 5636 are feasible and long overdue. Fossil energy companies routinely collect data on well sites, chemicals, wastewater, and other environmental monitoring. It is reasonable and necessary that these data be shared in an open, timely, and accessible way. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board disclosures requested in the bill were produced working closely with the extractives industry and align with the disclosures that public companies must anyway make annually to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. When energy companies fail to disclose their human and environmental footprints, it is others who will pay the price. The public pays in tax dollars when first responders, healthcare workers, local governments, and federal aid services must respond to disasters at fossil energy facilities. And nearby communities pay every day when they're exposed to harm from routine emissions, leaks, and other damages made worse by poor disclosure and management. Companies owe it to all of us to be responsible actors. The Transparency in Energy Production Act will help keep families informed, corporations held accountable, and the public safe. This is a future worth striving for. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goldman. I'd like to thank the panel for their testimony. I want to remind members of the committee that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on our questions. The chair is now going to recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. And I'm going to recognize Representative Levin for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Chair Lowenthal, for holding this hearing today. I represent a district and grew up in Southern California, where we've worried my entire life about air quality criteria air pollutants. I've also been an environmental attorney, so I have seen throughout my life the good work that we've done in Southern California to reduce those air pollutants. And I wanted to ask a few questions. Dr. Goldman, one argument from the fossil fuel industry seems to be that disclosing air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, water usage, pretty much any other impact is somehow too complicated or too burdensome for them to carry out. Yet other industries have done this. How have other industries been able to do this without it being too burdensome? And how can we learn from those experiences?
Thank you, Congressman. That's an important point. Many industries are already subject to these kinds of disclosure requirements around environmental reporting and health effects monitoring. This is something that companies regularly do, and other industries are required to do that under environmental laws. Unfortunately, many of our environmental laws have exceptions for the oil and gas industry, and so they haven't been subject to these same requirements. But other industries have done this. It has not been burdensome. They've been able to do this monitoring. And indeed, many fossil energy companies are anyway doing this monitoring to comply with other requirements or for their own information. So this wouldn't add any additional burdens on them. This is reporting they should anyway be doing. It aligns closely with what public companies are anyway asked by the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to report, and the SASB requirements that are requested in the bill were developed with the extractives industry, and so this is something that has had extensive industry input as well.
Thank you for that. I think that's an important point. One of the other things that I sometimes hear is that, you know, if we embrace clean energy or oppose continued use of fossil fuels, that somehow we're going to destroy the economy. And my California experience tells me that's simply not true, that you can grow the economy and protect the environment at the same time. Ms. Mason, do you believe the argument that reducing emissions and addressing climate change is bad for business, bad for a company's bottom line?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. No, I think quite the contrary, actually. I think opposing bills like the TIPA Act, simply all it does is it provides information to investors and the American people with some critical data. Undermining the economy, because how can it undermine it? It leads investors and policymakers to make critical decisions without the information. They don't make smart decisions from that standpoint. I guess just as an example, imagine purchasing a house without having done an inspection. How can the prospective homeowner have an accurate picture of the risks around the house? So I believe that as a nation, we cannot continue to invest these billions of dollars in companies that may not be viable for the long term and sustainable. And in fact, that is what would harm our nation's economy.
Thank you for that. I do acknowledge that many in the private sector are doing a lot when it comes to sustainability, and we appreciate those contributions. I also do sometimes hear that government should just stay out of it. And my follow-up for you, Ms. Mason, is do we need federal policies to help drive down greenhouse gas emissions, or can the private sector do it all by itself?
You know, the SASB is very similar to what happened with the FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board. If we had left financial accounting standards to voluntarily be provided, the investor community themselves would be at a great detriment to having accurate information. And so I think voluntary information flow, even though we would like to have that happen as individuals, I have found in business that it really is the requirements around that deliver the best transparency. And so that's part of why I think it's very important to have this act go through.
Mr. Chairman, if you could indulge one last question for Mayor Snover. I know that New Mexico recently regained the ability to fine oil and gas companies for violation, which I believe is an important tool for holding bad actors accountable. In general, what has been your experience with the state's enforcement over oil and gas operations, and what role do you think the federal government needs to play here?
Thank you, Congressman. I've been in New Mexico for about 5 years, and I've overlapped, the previous state administration and our current state administration with Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. And in my experience, in my short tenure as an elected official in Aztec, I've seen that we've gone from minimal enforcement and minimal following of the regulatory guidance to where we've really kind of turned the corner with our new administration and become more of a national leader in this enforcement to allow for, and I feel like it's kind of put the energy industry on notice that they are going to be held accountable and held to the standard that is already on the books for them.
Thank you, Mr. Snover.
Thank you, Representative Levin. I now call upon Representative Westerman for 5 minutes of questions. Well, you can begin now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for yielding his position for me to go first. Appreciate that, and appreciate our witnesses being here today talking about an important subject. Mayor Snover, as I listened to your testimony and went through it, I just had some questions to make sure I understand your position on this. You state that you estimate that approximately half of your students suffer from respiratory issues. Talk about how New Mexico's methane emissions are said to have the same short-term impacts on our climate as 22 coal-fired power plants or 28 million internal combustion automobiles. And you also state that policymakers must establish an ambitious goal of net zero emissions from public lands and waters by 2030. You've also got a paragraph in here where you say in New Mexico, under current regulations and rules, there's an annual loss of $275 million in energy resources, an additional $43 million in state tax and royalty revenue that we could and that we should be investing in our school system in a state where our education system consistently ranks in the lower tier nationally. Any opportunity to increase revenue for educational programs should be explored. So are you saying you should stop energy and mineral production on federal lands, or is the problem that the revenues off of those or the royalties aren't going into the school system?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I believe that we're in a transitional energy economy right now. And I would kind of liken it to when we were transitioning away from the horse-drawn carriage. We were using the technology we had to invent the technology of the future. And while we're getting royalties from the oil and gas industry, a lot of those are used for our educational programs. And as a high school teacher, in a school system, in a state that is traditionally in the lower tier nationally, I think it's incredibly important to take every opportunity that we can to increase funding for education. And this is one of the ways to do it. And if we're, in a sense, allowing that, as the chairman had mentioned about the methane leaks at the wellhead sites, it's basically leaving money on the table in my estimation. And I think that we need to do everything we can to stem that. And
your
to use our
position is
resources
not
the best we can.
necessarily to do away with energy and mineral exploration, but to make it safer and cleaner and to redirect the royalties or increase the royalties. I'm trying to understand.
Well, to kind of capture the royalties, not to necessarily redirect them, but to capture them. And I'm not suggesting that that the energy industry is going to go away in New Mexico overnight. But I am suggesting that based on the governor's plans to transition away to a carbon neutral energy environment is important, and I think that's the future of our country. And while we're doing that, we should do everything that we can to increase the amount of data available, to make best use of the resources that we are extracting. And
Okay, I'm going to have to move on. I'm
Yes, sir.
limited on time. But Dr. Goldman, You talked about, accounting for greenhouse gas emissions from energy exploration. I'm wondering if in your studies, have you looked at how much carbon is released in forest fires and decomposition of dead trees? And to follow up is, should there be reporting on those types of carbon emissions from public lands?
Thank you, Congressman. I think it is very important that we ensure we have as much reporting as possible on greenhouse gas emissions. When we look at the U.S. carbon budget, one thing that sticks out to me is the fugitive methane leakage and other greenhouse gas emissions from energy production sites. This is a significant part of our
But I'm
carbon
talking about
emissions.
forests, which cover millions of acres of public lands, and we've seen a rash of forest fires, an exponential increase in forest fires and the amount of carbon being released from forest fires. And I'm saying if we're going to do accounting, I think we should take that into the equation because it is all part of the carbon cycle. I wish we had more time to discuss, but Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time and I yield back.
Mr. Westerman, I'm allowing members to go a little bit over, so if you want to continue, please go forward for at least 1 more minute.
Thank you very much. So, I'm very concerned about the environment and how we are good stewards of that, but I think we discount the natural environment of forest and the ability of forest to make the air cleaner, to make the water cleaner. Two of the things that you mentioned in your testimony, yet it was all focused on fossil fuels. But I think there's also a positive side of what we can do to keep our forest healthier, which we know is good for the atmosphere and good for water. So do you have anything you would like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. That is something else that we should be thinking about. In the context of this bill, I have been thinking about how to better manage the emissions of energy production sites. That's the scope of what we're looking at here, and we know that that's something that we need a better handle on monitoring of. Many scientists do, of course, work on looking at carbon accounting of forests and what that looks like. I regularly attend conferences where that's a big discussion point. I think here we need to really be thinking about how are we getting a good handle on whether energy production sites, how they're doing on emissions, because we know from scientific studies that there's been a range of emissions that have been estimated from fossil energy companies, and so in order to better understand the role that plays in carbon emissions in the U.S., we need to start with the monitoring. We need to make sure that we have that information and companies are disclosing that data.
And I think that the bill is short-sighted in that it only looks at one side of the ledger. It doesn't consider all the possibilities of carbon emissions and the things that we can do to be better stewards. There's a wealth of scientific data that also talks about how much carbon gets released in forest fires and other events, and how much carbon we could sequester if we made our forest healthy, but we oftentimes have regulations that prevent any kind of management or work on the forest, which exacerbates the cycle of seeing these forests go up in flames. On top of the fact that I don't think we should be moving federal regulations out to a nonprofit or non-government organization that's highly politically motivated, the concept of measuring and keeping an accurate accounting of what's happening on our federal lands, I believe, is at least a good starting point. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. I'm now going to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions also. Dr. Goldman, I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about voluntary efforts by oil and gas companies on disclosure or self-regulation. What's been their track record on voluntary or self-regulations? And why have these been inadequate to protect the health of local communities?
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal. Voluntary disclosure has been inadequate. There's several voluntary regimes, SASB included, and those do play a useful role in providing information to investors and the public. Unfortunately, those are inadequate because not everyone does it and not everyone does it well. Many opt out of such regimes, especially those in the fossil energy industry, don't always participate in those sorts of initiatives, and even if they do, there's often not the level of detail that we need in order to protect the public safe and to know how companies are operating on public lands. This is unfortunately the situation despite pressure from investors, from the SEC, and through the voluntary initiatives to ensure that companies have more information disclosed. For the purposes of communities and observing what's happening on federal lands, we need disclosure to be more timely, we need it more accessible, and we need it to be consistent across companies and across states.
Thank you. Ms. Mason, why are shareholders and investors increasingly demanding that companies disclose the impacts associated with their businesses? Is it simply because they think it's the moral thing to do, or do they believe that there are financial benefits of publicly disclosing this information?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think that the American shareholders are necessarily viewing this as a moral decision as it is a financially driven decision. BlackRock itself is a financially driven organization. If you look at other members, even the founding members of SASB being Goldman Sachs, CalSTRS, CalPERS, these are financially driven organizations. And they have an interest in ensuring that whatever businesses they invest in long-term are viable and will be around to deliver returns and economic returns for them. In that manner, we view that, or at least I do in our organization, that the American people are shareholders in the public lands, and therefore they have a right to that level of transparency, just as public shareholders have rights of that transparency in their company investments themselves. So it is clearly a business decision from that standpoint.
Thank you. Mayor Snover, last spring, as I mentioned earlier, the subcommittee visited New Mexico and heard from local experts about the health impacts of methane emissions. Ms. Barbara Weber of Health Action New Mexico testified in our hearings about how the long-term exposure to ozone increases the risk of asthma in children and how the rate of asthma is higher in New Mexico than the national average. And you mentioned that already in some of the impacts upon your students. But how is your experience? Can you go into more depth about how the experience of the impact of methane and air pollution on your students? Can you really kind of describe that in a little bit more detail?
I'll do my best, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. First, I just want to make it clear, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a respiratory doctor. I'm not an environmental expert. I'm a retired Army Sergeant First Class. I teach Army Junior ROTC in the small town of Aztec, New Mexico.
And thank you for your service.
I appreciate that. Thank you. But I know what I experience. I know that when we go out on Fridays throughout the school day, we do a lot of PT or physical training. It's stuff that the Army mandates that we do as JROTC programs. We get a physical education credit through a New Mexico high school accreditation. And I often see kids running back to their bag, let me grab my inhaler just in case. There's days when it seems to be especially, kind of spikes a little bit more than others in the warmer months, of course. And it's just one of those things that, again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an expert in this field, I just know what I see, and it's anecdotal, and I'm not suggesting that that's the only cause of this and that it would completely go away, but you can't help but ask yourself if we have an opportunity as policymakers and as elected officials to try and do something, that doesn't mean it's going to fix the entire problem, but it certainly could go at least a short distance or some distance in helping to mitigate part of the problem. And I think it's that piecemeal way to fix a problem that we have to be aware of and that we have to take action on any chance we get. I mean, these kids need our help, and we should be there and be more concerned about their health and welfare than discussing profit and loss and cost of equipment.
Thank you, Mr. Snover. I now recognize Representative Hearn for his 5 minutes of questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. Leader Gosar, thank you. And our witnesses for being here to testify on the importance of public disclosure requirements. As a congressman from the 1st District of Oklahoma, I represent a lot of the people in the oil and gas industry, and it's 25% of our state budget and millions of jobs in our state. And I was hopeful that we would start this year off with hearings on the right foot and recognize the importance of what it is when we've seen what's recently happened in Venezuela and the Middle East, how important our fossil fuel dominance has been in the world and what it's mean to be a net exporter and how important that's been to the world geopolitical stage. But today is just another unfortunate episode in the relentless attack by my Democrat friends and the war on fossil fuels in the American energy sector. The bill before us today is no different than the policies that have been pushed over the last year. And like the Green New Deal, the bill would cripple our energy sector while also lining the pockets of unaccountable, unelected non-governmental organization funded by liberal Democrat presidential candidates who might be unelectable. My colleagues across the aisle claim that this bill is necessary because of a need for greater transparency, but this is nothing more than a veiled attempt to hamper our energy sector with more meaningless, tedious paperwork, more regulation. Additionally, this information could easily be used by anti-energy groups looking to hinder the regulatory process with frivolous lawsuits that provide us no benefits to the public. It is a bad bill, will never be considered by the Senate, and will never become law. Mr. Stein, you talk about this in your testimony as you note that this legislation will hamper our energy production by imposing unnecessary costs. You state that rather than a genuine bid for transparency, this legislation is more accurately described as an effort to impose higher costs on energy leasing on federal lands. Can you elaborate on this and how this bill would impose these costs on energy leasing and how this would affect our energy sector?
Sure. So there's lots of ways that the way this bill is constructed that would add on to costs. You talked about the frivolous litigation. That is already a problem with leases on all federal lands. We see it in Wyoming and Colorado. We've seen leases withdrawn because of problems with the NEPA process. This is just adding a whole new layer of process onto that, and every little section of these disclosures is vague about how much of something needs to be disclosed. Is there a certain threshold above it needs to be disclosed? How is something calculated? There's no metrics in there. So even if you go through all this work and do all this disclosure, every single section, environmentalist group can come in and sue and say, that's not enough, or you didn't include everything there. And it just it basically brings the entire leasing process to a halt. Even if there's an executive in the office that actually wants to pursue these leases.
Well, thank you. And it's clear these costs will be a great detriment to the energy sector. And you also talked about the duplicative nature of this legislation. It's my understanding that this information is already regularly reported through NEPA process and already is given to the EPA. This means the disclosure requirements will not only increase transparency, but also will hamper the energy industry and its ability to operate smoothly. Could you talk about the duplicative processes? And I think you started to allude to it a little bit with NEPA there, but can you talk about that as well? So how they're already reporting some of these requirements?
Well, certainly all the air emissions, all the NOx, SOx, even greenhouse gases are all reported to the EPA. So the EPA, the federal government already has this information. The estimates of methane or gas that is vented or flared, that is already filed with the BLM. Now, it's possible that the federal government, makes it hard to access that information. I think that's certainly possible. But through all the main sections of these, the SASB standards, that information is already being given to the federal government. The stuff that is not currently being reported to the federal government is the sort of things that don't really have anything to do with leasing on federal lands. Some of the sort of the global impacts. One of the sections says that you need an estimate of how many of your reserves are in or near conflict areas around the world. That doesn't really have anything to do with leasing on federal land.
So I appreciate you, again, you all being here today, and I think it's been very clear that every step of the way that my colleagues across the aisle have been trying to curtail the successes that we've seen in the fossil fuel industry. And whether it's this bill or a Green New Deal, which nobody on the left likes to talk about right now, they regularly overlook the necessity of the energy development blatantly and ignore the harm that these policies would cause. They would rather fuel the extreme and litigious anti-energy lobby and outsource regulatory requirements to a board funded by their friends who are identified as being the largest funders, and that's Democrat presidential candidate Mike Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, than to advocate for reliable sources of power and energy for the American people. And as someone who understands the negative effect my colleagues' actions would cause on Americans' energy industry, I cannot support their initiatives. And Mr. Chairman, can I ask just one question, just for clarity? If I may?
Absolutely.
Mr. Snover, I'm in a state that, football is played in the warm months. Both of my sons played outdoor baseball. This is the first I've heard that the energy industry is causing great harm to our kids. Do you have a percentage? And I appreciate your statement identifying that you're not a doctor. This is just anecdotal, but do you have a percentage of your kids that you think are being harmed by the methane releases in your community?
Well, like I said, Congressman, and thank you for the question, I can't obviously state exactly what is causing any respiratory issues, but I've taught in 2 different parts of the country, on the East Coast in West Virginia and back in New Mexico in Aztec, like I currently do. And while kids in this generation, I think it's fair, maybe have a higher propensity of diagnosed respiratory issues, again, anecdotally, from my experience, I would say 4 or 5 out of 10 display some sort of respiratory issue. And again, I'm not going to attribute it all to methane gas
But it'd be
leakage,
safe to say if that were, in your part of the country, if it were due to allergies to trees and particular plants, you wouldn't be for eliminating all those if that were the cause. Like, we live in one of the highest areas for allergy contaminants known in America, in the Midwest, but we're not advocating removing all the trees and plants. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And now I represent Representative Lujan. Welcome to the committee, and I recognize you for 5 minutes of question.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the ranking member and the members of the subcommittee today and the Natural Resources Committee for allowing me to testify a little bit here, if you will. And the reason I say that is I want to welcome our mayor from New Mexico, Mr. Victor Snover from Aztec, New Mexico. I know he's already been welcomed. I've had the honor of working with and getting to know the good mayor with his advocacy in the community, and I always appreciate his courage and his honesty in coming forward to do what's right in our community. So thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being here. Mr. Chairman, this is an important hearing, an important piece of legislation. I appreciate the conversation. Last April, the Natural Resources Committee, under your leadership and that of Chairman Grijalva, traveled to New Mexico to hold a hearing on the impacts of oil and gas on local communities. During the trip, we were able to visit an oil and gas well in the 3rd Congressional District and not just smell the methane emissions, but with a piece of technology called the forward-looking infrared camera, you're actually able to see the emissions. Now, it was the first time I've ever looked out of one of those cameras. You could smell it while you were there. But what you could see through this camera were plumes as large as anything that you can imagine. Think about when clouds gather and you look up and you see the immensity associated with the gathering of that humidity. These plumes look just like those clouds, the size of any distance that I could describe. It was alarming. It's something to smell it. It's another thing to smell it and see it. To make matters worse, the federal government does not properly account for how much gas is emitted from these wells into our atmosphere. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, New Mexico releases 205,000 metric tons. However, a group of leading scientists by the Environmental Defense Fund went to more than 100 sites to make on-the-ground measurements and determined that methane emissions in New Mexico are likely closer to 1 million metric tons, 5 times higher than the EPA number. Now, the Transparency in Energy Production Act would simply require public disclosure from oil and gas companies operating on public lands, also renewable companies operating on public lands, so that the public knows what's happening in their backyards. That's all that this legislation is doing and saying, and I appreciate the information that has already been submitted into the record. There's a table that lists everything that's required. It's titled Table 1, Required Disclosure, Topics and Accounting Metrics for Public Land Operations. So in the short time I have left, Mayor Schnover, as a father, a high school instructor, and a mayor, are you concerned with how climate change will impact the lives of children and the future of communities?
Thank you, Congressman Lujan, and might I add a new grandfather as well. So
Congratulations.
with all of those things in mind, I think all of us are concerned about the future of our climate, and as all of those things, as an elected official that helps provide input for policy, as a high school teacher that sees their kids suffering from respiratory issues, and not only that, but some of the disparities of like we had said in my testimony, of not being able to move away from these areas that you described. I wasn't there with you that day, but I've experienced similar smells, similar, not the views, because I haven't had access to one of the cameras, but of course, I think it's a problem that we have to tackle, we have to be proactive on, and merely saying that we can't afford it is not acceptable in the richest country in the nation.
In New Mexico, under the leadership of our new governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, there was a bipartisan effort to move legislation forward to reduce, capture with the goal of eliminating methane emissions in New Mexico. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And are those conversations continuing to move in a positive fashion under with what you're aware of, Mr. Mayor?
Yes, sir. From what I'm aware of, they are moving in a positive direction. These things are always large, complicated issues to tackle. There's many interests to consider, but I do believe they're moving in a positive direction, and I think the governor, I appreciate her leadership on this and her willingness to get us on the right side of history on this one.
And lastly, stopping intentional flaring and venting and leaking of natural gas is good for everyone's bottom line. It's good for taxpayers, it's good for the industry. Everyone will make more money, and we'll have healthier communities and better air quality if we get it done. So I'm hoping that we'll find a way to get some of this done together. I thank the indulgence of the chairman of the committee for their time today.
Thank you, Representative Lujan. I now recognize the ranking member and thank him for allowing his members to go first, and appreciate that. And I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Now, I'd like to turn our attention to the renewable energy projects for a moment, since even wind and solar developments do not escape this legislation unscathed. One of the standards outlined for renewable energy projects is sustainable sourcing of raw materials, including copper, cobalt, rare earths, and many others. I completely agree that this is a critical evaluation in the development of solar and wind technologies. But I find it very ironic to be discussing these concerns today, since my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem determined to prevent domestic hard rock mining at every opportunity, both in committee and on the House floor. Even though the country has some of the best labor and environmental standards in the world. Would you agree with that, Ms. Mason, that we have some of the best environmental and labor laws in the world?
I'm not an expert in that area, so I can only... Sorry about that. I'm not an expert on labor law or environmental laws. I can only speak from the standpoint of the businesses that I invest in, which are not renewable energy companies or any climate-related companies.
Well, you made the comment about Goldman Sachs.
Goldman
So, I mean,
Sachs,
you know, if they're underlying that, I mean, we had some, I would in fact, I'll go to the good doctor. Do we have some of the best environmental and mining techniques in the world?
Thank you, Congressman, or Ranking Member. We have protective
Yes or no?
environmental
Because
laws.
it's a yes or no answer.
We have protective environmental laws. Yes.
Yeah, we have the best. They rank higher than China, do they not?
I imagine so.
Yes, and how about India?
I imagine so.
How about Mexico?
I don't know for certain.
No, it is. Once again, these are hard facts. And so when we look at supply chains, we have to start looking at this, particularly when we're going in as the mayor said, a transition in energy production. So this is all included. So, Mr. Stein, in regards to that, can you comment on the labor laws and the environmental dictations that we require in the United States?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely correct. Our environmental standards are higher, frankly, than even in many countries in Europe. We are very aggressive about protecting the environment in the United States. Now, one of the effects of that has been that we've ended up not developing a lot of these minerals in the United States, but that doesn't mean that we don't continue to demand those materials for renewables, the steel and renewables, all the cobalt. Most of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where it's mined in essentially modern-day slavery conditions.
Yeah,
So
and just to that point, who is the principal owner in the Congo of some of those mines?
Well, sometimes it's very hard to tell, but at
Most
the
of
ground
them
level,
are
it's
China.
it's warlords, frankly, and then the Chinese then extract those products. Because they buy from anyone, they don't have scruples like we do about bribery and funding.
Well, that also goes with
progressive
One Belt,
governments.
One Road dictation, does it not?
Sorry, I didn't.
So the One Belt, One Road is
Yes.
China leverages,
Sure.
infrastructure at the cost of having resources.
And it also involves building a lot of new coal plants all over the world, too.
Yeah. So when we look at this, the vast majority of renewable energy is developed on state and private land, with only about 1% of wind farms located on federally owned land, with the overwhelming majority on private land. Wouldn't this bill adversely impact investments in the renewable energy development as well as conventional energy production?
Sure. So a lot of the lawsuit risk that I was mentioning earlier, that equally applies to wind and solar production, because this actually happens with a lot of solar farms is that they get sued for effects on endangered species. Wind farms also have the same problem affecting endangered species. So these series of lawsuits going through each section of these disclosure standards, that's going to slow down wind and solar development too in exactly the same way.
So we're also in a dichotomy in the fact that these alternative energy modalities are intermittent. They're not baseload, right, Mr. Stein?
Sure.
So how do we have to look at that mitigation so that we have a constant current going through our transmission lines? How do we have to look at the displaced value? Because when you look at solar, it's the afternoon that we get too much of it. I mean, in fact, California pays Arizona to take their excess solar, which totally changes our dynamics in our marketplace. Can you describe a little bit about that?
Sure, because wind and solar are so intermittent, it requires backups of some sort. And frankly, today, most of that backup is done by natural gas. And a lot of times in the calculations of the greenhouse gas emissions or greenhouse gases avoided, those calculations aren't taken into account. They're assumed that it will eventually have batteries at some point in the future. But these batteries, it's thousands of tons of the minerals that we're talking about being shipped in from all over the world, processed in China, and then produced in these batteries, and then recycled. So all that life cycle cost really isn't included in this cost avoided, greenhouse gases avoided.
In fact, we've seen the other side have an intentional prohibition of actually mining for these, even though they're all over. Like, I'm from the state of Arizona. In fact, Mayor Snowden and I actually have family that live in Aztec. So, I mean, we see somebody talking out of one side of the mouth and then completely onto the other side of the mouth.
Well, it's true. If these minerals aren't mined in the United States, they have to be mined somewhere. If we're going to build we're talking about, to replace our existing electricity, we talk about 100% renewables. We're talking about 12% of the continental United States just in wind farms, just to replace current electricity production. I mean, that's a vast undertaking of construction, and those minerals have to come from somewhere.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, for the record, I'd like to submit a letter from the National Mining Association in regards to against this bill.
Without objection.
And one last point. When we talk about transparency and evaluation, I find it interesting that we still do not have the dissertation about climate, what was actually done for background, to have all the information, how it was actually looked at. I'm a believer that climate always changes, but we need to have all the data and how it was collected, where it was collected, and making that transparent for the American public, because that's never been disclosed. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. We're going to be closing this hearing, but before we close the hearing, I'd like to ask each witness one last question. What is the one question you were not asked today that you wish you were asked, and what would be your answer to that? So is there any question, if you don't think that was any question, then just say no. But is there one question that you were not asked that you wish you were asked by the panel up here? And what would be your answer to that question? All right, I'm going to start then with Ms. Mason. Is there any question you were not asked that you would have liked, you came prepared, or you would have liked to have been asked? And if not, that's fine.
I think actually the committee did an excellent job of the questions across the board, so I have nothing to add.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Snover, is there one question that you would have liked to have been asked that now's your opportunity, and what's your answer, or you'd like to elaborate on some answer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just like to maybe touch on about the Energy Transition Act that was enacted in New Mexico last year, which included $40 million to help Northwest New Mexico transition away from coal, and whether I support providing transition assistance to impacted communities. And my answer is, of course, because as we had talked through some of the question and answer and some of the testimony about transitioning our energy economy to a more renewable energy economy, there are going to be people that are kind of lost or potentially left behind in these transitions. Folks that are, I mean, I hate to admit it, but my age, in their early 50s and older, that have been in a career for decades perhaps, and they know nothing else. They don't, possibly have any other, readily marketable skills. But I think it's our obligation as elected officials and policymakers that we have a role to play to provide the best possible outcomes for those hardworking New Mexicans specifically, that they just want to provide a good life for their families. They want to be able to pay their bills. They want to have pride in what they do every day. And, as we transition into this new energy economy, they don't have time to worry about what we're doing here today. They're just trying to go to work and make a living. And I think it's important that we support these laws, such as the Energy Transition Act in New Mexico, and try and give these folks as much opportunity to move into the next phase of their careers as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Snover. Mr. Stein, any question that you would have liked us to ask, or you'd like to elaborate on some answer that this is your opportunity.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out the question here is, why is this needs to be put on the private sector? As I've said, a lot of this stuff is already reported to the federal government. If local communities or independent groups aren't able to get this information, that's a government transparency problem. It's not the companies themselves that aren't sharing this information. So I think the question is why this cost needs to be put on the private sector rather than being put on these agencies whose job it is to monitor these sorts of things anyway.
Thank you. And Dr. Goldman, one question or something you'd like to elaborate on?
Thank you, Chairman. I want to address the question of why this matters. Why does disclosure matter? And when I think about that, I think about the fact that this matters to the more than 8,000 residents who were displaced from their homes during the Aliso Canyon disaster a few years ago. And it matters to the indigenous communities that are living downstream of energy production sites without even knowing what might be being emitted into their waterways. And it matters to the countless people in this country who live in the shadow of energy production sites and wake up every day wondering if their headache or their child's nosebleed is the result of toxic pollution from a nearby facility. We owe it to them to ensure that this vital information is disclosed. This bill has requirements that are feasible and long overdue for companies, but more importantly, this bill is necessary and urgent for the American people.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a question of the chair? So in Arizona, we have the Navajo Generating Station, and as you know, the tribes actually are under the purview of Congress because of trust agreement. How would this legislation work when we have the trust responsibility? Would the Navajo Nation be responsible to report to this board? Because it seems very odd that, and a contradiction of our due diligence under the Constitution.
To answer your question, as it is written, it does not apply to the tribes at all.
May I,
Well, once
Ranking
again-
Member, may I elaborate on my comment?
Well, once again, to the chair, once again, that sets one standard for one set of people and a different set for another. So how?
That's why we call it sovereign nation.
Okay, now that you opened up that worm, once again, they're wards of the federal government because they come every year to the United States under the auspices of appropriations. A sovereign entity has no entailments to another government. So it's a pseudo type of application. So once again, how can we establish one standard for one group of people and not another?
Well, we do, and so I would be willing to work with you to really discuss that issue in a hearing. I think you've raised an important issue. We do not deal with that in this bill at all, but you've raised an issue that I don't think has to do specifically just with this bill. It has to do with all bills that really have to do with when we're talking about dealing with Native Americans on their designated lands. So I'd be willing to work with you. I think
Well,
that's an interesting question that you raised. How come we have two standards?
Well, it goes beyond that, because we've had some discussion in regards to Chaco Canyon.
Yes.
In regards to, an amendment that is a requirement because of the Native Americans who have allotments behind that aspect. They have to be able to have access and to increase their claim. And so once again, we keep running into this roadblock, and I think it's something that we ought to address sooner than later in that regards. So from that standpoint, I just want to bring up that discussion.
Thank you. And with that, I believe that we've kind of completed the hearing, and I'd like to say the members of the committee here may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we're going to ask you to respond in writing for any additional questions. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit their witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses from the members. If there's no further questions, no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.